We're going to talk about potential answers to the question, what is nationalism? Because I myself have used this word and this concept as something that will be a preferential alternative to many things that I find objectionable. So we can establish, first off, let's see here. So if you were going to go ask most people, and if you would ask me at some point, maybe a year ago or so, what is nationalism? The easy answer would be that it's, or nationalism and populism, it's the movement of Donald Trump, Brexit, the Italian elections, Marine Le Pen, the AFD, all these things that we've got right now that are challenging to a great degree the post-1945 world order that has been defined by welfare capitalism and neoliberalism. So this stuff is basically toxic, and by this stuff I'm talking about nationalism and populism. It's utterly toxic to the New World Order. It's toxic to the internationalists, the globalists, and all of these people that generally we don't like very much due to their policies. Toxic to the usual suspects, we'll say. Interpret that, however you like. But so we're in this case, this first case, we'd be defining nationalism in opposition to the things that we don't like. But this negative definition is not good enough because it doesn't really say what nationalism is. And so my attempt to figure out what nationalism is, I can define it most clearly by using the example of socialism. So we'll talk about two different kinds of socialism. We'll talk about national socialism and international socialism. National socialism, as you well know, was the political philosophy of the Hitlerite regime in Germany. More or less, fascist movements are in the same vein, and what they do, and also many military regimes are essentially national socialist in their policies. So this is a modernist worldview. So it's not going back into the past, but it's moving forward in history. So it accepts a lot of concepts that traditionalists would find objective, but it basically involves social conservatism and right-leaning sympathies with regards to ethical and moral issues, but leftist economic policies. And then, like I said, it's still progressive, so it's still concerned with technology and forward advancement. International socialism is world revolution. Trotskyism, Marxism, standard communism, Marxism-Leninism. The idea here is that you are going to take violent control of a political system in one place, and then you're going to expand that to the point where you have control over the entire world, and then you're going to set things up for a utopia, and then you're finally going to roll back your totalitarian control, and then the utopia will be established. And I would like to emphasize that even in the 1870s, they were saying Marxism was totalitarian. So this stuff was going on in Marx's lifetime. So the goal of international socialism is world domination, allegedly for the benefit of the worldwide human population, although it's an open question as to whether this is a front or whether it's legitimate. And certainly in every type of political movement, you're going to find some people who really believe it, and then some people who are using it pragmatically or instrumentally for their own purposes. And the ratio is really what's important, not finding one person of this kind and one of the other kind. What we really want to know about political activist groups is how many of one type and how many of the other. So putting these two types of socialism together, national socialism and international socialism, the difference with the nationalist variety is that it's centered not on world conquest and the establishment of a utopia, but rather on bringing benefits to one group one national group, a nation, or an ethno-national group, a particular people, a folk, whatever you want to call it. That's the difference. And so you can, by extension, put this this national versus international dichotomy onto other political ideologies. For example, neoliberalism, I don't know if we've ever seen a national neoliberal government, but we've certainly seen lots or many influential international neoliberal regimes, to the point where neoliberalism seems to be internationalism by necessity, just like communism is. If you're a neoliberal, you want to expand those practices to everybody else in the world so that they can be more trading partners for you and so that your trade can be more efficient. And that's basically the story of the 20th century and the post-1945 world order as a conflict between international socialism and international neoliberalism. And as I said in the first part of this about what is nationalism, that's why all of these people hate nationalism, is because they're both international, whether they're socialists, international socialists, or neoliberals. They just hate it. They can't stand it. But this is how I had understood it. But the more that I read about the revolutions of 1848 and the French Revolution, the more the third type of nationalism, third definition of nationalism, is coming into my mind and becoming more interesting. So I would like to thank Branko Malic, who is a Croatian guy who publishes through an outlet called Kali Tribune. And I agree with about a third of what he says. A third of it I completely disagree with, and the other third I'm not interested in or don't understand. But I would say that you should definitely go listen to the guy, because his level of discourse is much higher than a lot of other stuff that you can find, and it's a very small channel, very small outlet, but the quality is very, very high, even when I think that he's just way too egotistical in his thinking or wrapped up in the sound of his own voice. Even then, the discourse is very high, so I think you should go look at it. But what he pointed out, and Matt Johnson talked about this too, is the 18th and 19th century version of nationalism, which is kind of something that retarded my own political development, because when I was a younger person, you go to a dictionary or an encyclopedia or some book that has to deal with political ideologies and world history, and you start reading about nationalism, and it's very dull, and you just get bored with it. This idea is that these people wanted to unify a certain territory that was inhabited by people of one particular ethnic group or national group, or several groups that are closely related and therefore constitute one larger group. So we're talking about Italians, which are composed of, 5 or 6 different ethnic groups, makes up the Italian nation. Same thing for the Germans, same thing for the French. And the British, of course, have like 5 large ethnic groups that, were constituting that. So this idea of nation is something that is reified out of these groups that are closely related but yet distinct in their local traditions, their culture, their history, probably their genetics, because previously in history people didn't mix a whole lot. You had local, villages and tribes and clans, so they actually are more closely related to each other than other people 100 miles away or something like that. So nationalism in the 18th and 19th century was typically this political project that sought to unify these people belonging to, let's say, the French nation, or the so-called French nation, the Italians or the Germans, under one political body. Because Italy, as you know, was broken up into a whole bunch of city-states, principalities, and a couple of different kingdoms, and then the papal states in Rome. So a bunch of Freemasons, led by a guy named Giuseppe Garibaldi, made it a huge political project to try to bring all of these different folks under one into one political entity, and to establish a republican democracy to rule them. And so if you read about the French Revolution, the idea is that there is no God, or if there is a God, it's not really the God from Christian tradition and Christian teachings and European history, or post-Constantine European history. It's not that. It's some sort of essence, some sort of pantheistic essence, or some watchmaker or something else, but it's not the Christian God. And so if it's not that, then you're going to have to get your ideas about how to structure your society from somewhere other than tradition. And so this third definition of nationalism, which actually predates the other two, this is the one you're going to find in the history textbooks and such, is about a radical, progressive, anti-cultural, anti-traditional political movement, I think largely, although not exclusively, headed by secret societies who agreed with enlightenment principles, who were generally anti-religious and certainly anti-Christian, who wanted to institute popular government and appeal to popular sovereignty. And you see the same thing in France, Germany, and Italy. The French Revolution we'll talk about just briefly. In the German case, they tried this, but it failed. It was actually the German monarchy that united all these German territories into two German states, Germany and Austria, and then they didn't get the Republic until after World War I, when the German monarchy collapsed. In Italy, where we are today, we do have one unified Italian state, and that took a lot of effort. But in France, it's the case that people know about the most, and probably the most well documented, and probably the most influential. So in France, in the radical phase of the French Revolution, Christianity was outlawed finally, and a deistic cult was introduced. And this was after the rights of religious orders, local priests, and the Catholic hierarchy had been, their rights and privileges had been reduced over a long period of time, finally to the point where it was banned outright. This was extremely unpopular in everywhere outside of the urban areas. And this, along with the compulsory education that the people and the French revolutionary leaders tried to implement, with standardized textbooks originating out of the capital and a couple of large cities. This was the attempt to, in my opinion, exterminate all of the local differences that existed in pre-revolutionary France that had accrued over a period of probably 1,000 years or more. All these provinces and cities and local regions had their own privileges and customs. Some paid more taxes, some paid less. They spoke different languages or different dialects. They had different religious customs. They had their own local saints, churches, and all these different kind of things that make up the history of a people and a place. Well, the goal of these French revolutionary leaders was to basically go through and wipe all this stuff out, level it off, and then reorganize society using their own reason. Because all of this older stuff was viewed as, basically just people languishing in darkness. And now these revolutionary leaders who have the power of the Enlightenment can use their high faculties of reason to redesign society in, surely a utopian kind of way. And the only way that I think that this could possibly be sold to the public is through an us versus them type of method. So the French people were only finally mobilized when the Austrians were invading, and so that formed, like a concept of French nation that I think probably didn't exist before that, and certainly couldn't be promoted as all of their local customs and traditions were being destroyed. So my thesis that I wanted to promote, or that I wanted to assert, is that the goal of these 18th and 19th century nationalist leaders was simply to let me see if I can remember the quote by Hilaire Belloc, who I was shocked when I finally read a book by Hilaire Belloc, because I thought he was a conservative type of guy. That's how he had been. That's how I had read about him. This is like a conservative Catholic who's a great apologist for the Catholic religion. When I read his book on the French Revolution, it's complete liberal modernism. He's totally gung-ho about the revolution, and making apologies for all of the horrible things that were done and all the things that were destroyed that shouldn't have been destroyed. But Hilaire Belloc said that the goal of the French revolutionary leaders was to create a centralized, homogeneous democracy. That was the goal. And so I don't think that there's anything inside of the Enlightenment principles that would lead you to want to establish a centralized, homogeneous democracy that ended at national borders. I don't think that there's any way that you can get that out of a materialist, deistic, reason-based political program, political philosophy that in which you want it to be homogeneous and democratic. That's a totally egalitarian, ahistorical perspective. And so if this was their goal, and I think he was right when he said that, then there's really no reason to stop at national borders. And indeed, you saw the French revolutionary government invading the Austrian Netherlands and Belgium very quickly. Before they'd even gotten their own house and border, and in order, they were already invading their neighbors to impose this form of government on these people. And so this version of nationalism, I think, is misnamed, and or our version is misnamed, whichever it is, but it doesn't really match up. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a very good lecture online on YouTube. If you look up Freemasons in the Greek War of Independence, you'll find it. And it's a guy just reading a paper that he'd written. But in that, he describes how these guys from France, from a lodge, all volunteer to go fight in the Greek War of Independence. And, it's not because I don't necessarily think that the Greeks being independent of the Turkish Empire is a bad thing. But you have to ask the question of why these French Freemasons were volunteering to go do this stuff. It's not to free the Greek from the Turkish yoke so that the Greeks can engage in their millennia-long history again independently. It's to promote the same Enlightenment values in yet one more country that can operate as a republican democracy and another outpost of these ideas. So that's all I have to say about nationalism. Thank you for your time.